Ben, hi, nice to see you again. It's been a couple of days, hasn't it? So my introduction, ladies and gentlemen, is a little strange because this event, co-hosted by Peter Kavalek, who you can see waving approximately now, is inspired by actually two of the people that are here this afternoon. So Alfredo, I'll explain the title very briefly. Number one is that Peter did a session for us on the Thulacine. It was part of the President's series for Cybernetics Society, and it was a really good conversation. He said afterwards, "That's why I became an academic. Why don't we do it more often?" So that's number one. And the second conversation with is Ben, also here, and Ben and I were talking about the forthcoming Cybernetics Society conference and the limitations of conventional approaches to such things, and said, wouldn't it be a good idea to have a not a conference? So this is a not a conference where the idea is the answers come out at the end rather than being machined in at the beginning. The specific title, How to Organise a University, comes from my, I've got to put the adverts in, haven't I? The latest book, the subtitle of which is How to Organise a Country. And that was the application of cybernetic thinking to the idea of the nation state. And I think, Peter, it was actually your suggestion in one of your emails that title came out of. So,
yeah.
So this is the first in a series of not a conferences. The next one, I think, is about consulting models or theoretical models in consulting practice. And then we're going to talk about identity. So we're going to have some fun this summer. So enough from me. Peter, do you want to introduce yourself? I think most people know roughly who I am.
Yeah, they know roughly who you are. And hello to everyone from me. I'm Peter Kavalek from Loughborough University, where I'm Director for the Centre for Information Management. That means a professor, previously at Manchester, hence the conversation we were just having. My pleasure to meet most of you today, those of you who have not met before, and to be reacquainted with those that I do know. I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks, Peter. So just to remind everybody, what we're going to do is we're going to hear from three agents provocateurs, and I hope they will be provocative. I'm looking at Nick and anticipating something here. We'll ask questions for clarity more than anything else at the end of their little sessions. And then we'll go to breakout rooms. I think we'll just have 2 breakout rooms with 16 of us if the numbers stay the same, to talk about what we've heard and to put our ideas on the table for what we think the question means, which is really the sort of point of the exercise. We'll spend some time doing that, and when we've all had enough, we'll get back together again, share our insights and ideas, and see if we can synthesize something out of it. I have no idea what at this point. Peter and I talked about this yesterday. So, yeah, from our point of view, the more organic this is, the better. The more the answer emerges from the process, the happier we are. Because if we knew the answer to the question, we probably wouldn't be asking it. Nobody is right and nobody is wrong in this forum. You have an opinion, and that's fine. But let's get all the opinions out there and then see what we can explore. So we're going to hear from, I'll get the names right, Leon Gagici. Leon's a final year student at Loughborough, studying, get it right, politics and economics with no philosophy, brackets. Then we're going to hear from Nick Taylor, and Nick is prof at University College London, and get it right, are you the director of the Centre for Institute for Transport Studies, Nick? Yeah, I got that bit right. And he's just about to open a brand new sparkling facility at Dagenham, which maybe you'll tell us about if you get a minute during the course of the afternoon, Nick, because I think Pearl is pretty exciting. And then finally, we're going to hear from Catherine Laws, where Catherine up at the top marked C. And Catherine is representing into this conversation the voice of society, because she's apparently a grown-up. So that's where we're going to go, and then we'll basically see what happens thereafter. At which point, I'm going to shut up. I will tell you we are being recorded, because we want the recording, so just be aware of that. And hand the floor, if I may, to Leon, who is currently on mute.
Well, not mute anymore, and you know, no pressure being the first one. But so when I thought about the question, how to organize a university, I looked at it in 2 fronts. The first one being obviously the teaching, because without a university teaching, what's the point of a university? And the first thing that came to mind was building a rocket. You know, if I want to make a massive rocket that goes all the way to Mars, I don't want to sit in classes that, you know, teach me how to do engineering for boats and stuff. So I think in terms of organizing a university, in terms of its teaching, I think it needs to be more directed towards a single cause. I think, obviously people here can tell me otherwise, but I believe only about a third of people actually use their degree. So I think creating more directed courses towards certain things, building a rocket, for example, and this is just because of the Elon Musk in my head right now. But for example, building a rocket, going into lobbying, you know, becoming a protester, which I don't even know if you can teach that in some way, but just as an example. And in terms of the style of teaching itself, I mean, what we're doing right now is a perfect example of how it should become more hybridized. And honestly, I think university before Zoom meetings and everything was pretty inflexible considering now. You know, what's wrong with me sitting on a beach in Croatia while learning my economics class? Obviously a bit of an exaggeration because, you know, London rain, but yeah. And in terms of the general organization, I think when looking at university, particularly looking at it from a student and from what I've heard from other friends around me, I feel like universities have sort of lost the point of a university. And instead, particularly around my friend group, it's being seen more as a business that makes its money off people who, you know, sort of see this as the only way forward. And I'm not saying that there's not other opportunities such as apprenticeships and things like that, but particularly from me coming from an immigrant family, university is pretty much the only thing that's drilled into your head. So I feel like to then, particularly with this pandemic, to then say, no, we want your money. We're going to give you online teaching that may or may not give you the amount of support as before. You know, the emails will still be there, but it'll take a little bit longer. So I feel like the universities in general have to build back up that sense of community as before. I mean, particularly in Warwick, you know, the issues of the protests that are happening, I don't know if they still are, but over the sexual assault, I had a friend who was there in the protests, and she said that the dean actually came out of his office and sidestepped around the tents itself. And, you know, to me, that's just a sense of that university is supposed to be a community where like-minded people get together, where students can learn from their professors and, you know, feel a sense of connection that in the business world, obviously Catherine can say otherwise, but to me, I feel like in the business world, especially in that hierarchical system, I feel like you don't get as much connection to, you know, people who may know more than you than in university. And I feel like as things have gone on, as obviously the loans have increased, the interest behind the loans, I feel like the community behind that has been lost. And I feel like there's a huge cut between students and the organizers of the university itself. And, you know, just for fun, I was also looking at the general building of a university, because I feel I've been pretty heavy on these other two topics. So why not make it a little bit more nice? In terms of the general building of a university, you know, building on that community theme, I feel like, you know, obviously more green spaces should be great. You know, think of a typical American teen movie where you have people sitting in the grass, reading books and whatever, and hippies on their guitars and stuff. But yeah, a university should be focused around the community, and as such, the building of it, you know, the buildings behind it should inspire community, creativity, and general discussions between peers and even those who might know more than you do. So yeah, that's just my general thoughts. I mean, I'm happy. I believe Q&A comes later. Is that right, John?
Hopeless, aren't we? Yeah. After a year, we should have cracked it by now and remember to turn stuff on and off. I'm struck by the hippies on guitars comment, Leon. You must have been looking when I was a teenager and failed to get into university at the age of 18.
Oh, my sister's one of those people. Loves to play the guitar on grass.
Okay, so anybody got any sort of questions, quick points they want to clarify with Leon, or should we move on? Alfredo.
Could I ask just the graph, what is now? Was it Leon? Could I ask Leon, I know it's a different, well, I can say, well, particularly what do you, but in general, what do you think students want from a university? I mean, you are criticizing for being a business, and I'm totally with that criticism, absolutely with you. But do the students not bring it on themselves? I mean, do the students just go to a university as part of a process, leave school, go to university, get a degree, come out, get a job? So they are, in a sense, encouraging this process of a business type sequence. Is that a fair comment, or what do you think on that?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair comment, but I feel like it's one of those things that, you know, you get into university thinking, you know, I'm going to come out with a degree, get into a job and everything. And, you know, you get into first year, you understand that obviously university is far beyond anything you've done in school before, where you might have known the whole year, every single teacher and whatnot. You come into university and understand that, you know, this is an opportunity to learn and to explore, you know, not only your career opportunities, but also who you are as a person. So I think while Alfredo, you make a very good comment about students are essentially perpetrating this, I feel like I've lost my train of thought. I feel like, you know, what students want exactly out of university is to be able to communicate better. So I feel like it's one of those things that students realize that once they get into university.
So you mean you're saying it's not just getting a job, there's still some students at least who actually just want to go and learn about whatever, life, learn the subject, learn about life, mixed with fellows. I mean, that collegiate sense is still there, is it? Or is it, I'm retired now, but I get the impression that a lot of students are just seen as a business. They just go in, come out. But you're trying to reassure me that some of them still actually like to go and just sit around and talk and learn.
Yeah, I mean, sitting here right now, I'm able to confidently say I'm one of those people. I mean, you know, without communicating, I wouldn't have met Peter. I wouldn't have met all you great guys here that, you know, challenge me. But
okay, I'm going to intervene and ask. Tanya's had her hand up for a little while, so we'll take a question from Tanya, and then we'll move on to Nick. Who? Where have you gone, Tanya?
Here I am. Thank
Hi.
you for that. Hello, everybody. You may not have seen me before, so I'm very much an outsider to the society. But Leon, thanks for your view. I too am a fellow student at Loughborough University. And I'd like to ask you to elaborate on your comment about making the courses more detailed. So if you compare the UK system to the American system, our courses and our degrees are typically shorter because of the fact that they are more focused. So in the US, typically, they give you 1 year to explore your final major, and accordingly, you make your choice. And then the rest of the degree is more catered to your interests. So I'd like to ask you, do you truly believe that having a more focused approach will be more appealing? Because as you said, it seems the notion is amongst first year students that they are here to get a degree, they're here to get a job. Whereas I think where the UK education system in general falls short, and some of my American peers have told me that the US system is very good because it gives you a very holistic approach to learning. You get to experience multiple modules and you get to emerge as a citizen as opposed to just an educated individual. So do you truly believe that a focused, more streamlined learning is the way to go, or fostering a sort of curiosity by introducing a more multidisciplinary component to degrees?
Yeah, I think, because you make a really good point here. So the point I was trying to get across was, you know, obviously people want to nurture their interests. I mean, I know a guy who finished university in America, and, you know, he was getting extra credits just by creating an entrepreneurs club, because that's what he wanted to do later on in life. So while I do agree with you on the holistic teaching, I mean, there are a whole bunch of papers, I can probably link them later, talking about the benefits of them. I do feel like, you know, when you come into a university, you come out with a purpose. And, you know, what James has just said in the comment there for it not counting, I think first year should be about that holistic approach, but that the later years should become more focused than just, you know, case in point with economics, being about just reading about economics and only by the second semester of the final year, am I able to truly specialize in what I want? You know, going back to the rocket example I said earlier, I feel like your first year should be trying to figure out whether you want to make a rocket to Mars, a rocket to the moon, or a submarine or whatever. And then the later years moving on to become even more like head down towards that.
Okay, that makes more
Thank
sense.
you. So thanks for that. Thanks, Tanya. Don't go away. Nice to see you. And that's a really nice question. And so talking of transport, and that's a marvelous segue you've just provided us with. Delighted to introduce properly Nick Tyler. And Nick is going to talk about his perspective on the, as you say, the voice of the academic. So Nick, over to you.
Yeah, that's a bit daunting. So I thought I would start. Thank you very much for that. That was a really interesting intervention, questions and things. And it kind of follows on. So I'm going to have a slightly different view, as you might expect. So I thought I'd start by thinking kind of question that Leon asked, which is, you know, what's the university for? And why do we have these things? And so I think, for my view, I think universities are there to enable us to create understanding. And that comes in two kind of ways. One is we need to figure out whether we know anything at all. So what do we know and what could we know? And let's create new knowledge. Let's create the wisdom to be able to use knowledge well and understand how that is going to happen. And that is kind of done through the exploration of research and things like that. And then in parallel with that, you can't just do that on its own, because otherwise that's a kind of sort of monastery thing. Really important is then to be able to communicate that to others. And part of that communication is obviously to students, and the idea of actually exploring with students how one actually makes that knowledge, how one learns it, what knowledge there is and what knowledge those students can create in the future is actually really important part. And we call that teaching. Personally, I would ban the word teaching from university. I think it is far too didactic. And I think that it's all really about learning. And what we are doing is learning how to learn. And the students that we teach today are going to be people in the future who are going to have a society in the future which is going to have to thrive. And therefore, what I think is a thriving civilization may not be what will be a thriving civilization in the future. And the students are the one way of actually being able to make that transition. And so that creation of understanding, of being able to use knowledge wisely, is actually what is going to drive their survival in future generations. And the other people that we have to make that kind of dissemination to, of course, is everybody else. So together with our students, we then need to think through how do we actually help the rest of society make these kinds of transitions and so on. Now, that sounds very sort of ephemeral, but that's kind of, I think, why we have them as a society. What has the university kind of become? As was said earlier, it's become a kind of business. And now I think universities see themselves as basically the deliverers of degrees. They have students, the students are their customers, the students come in, they pay a fee, the university delivers something which ends up with a degree, which most students acquire. And that is one part of what they deliver. Another part of what they deliver is, as part of that business, is essentially the sort of exploitable innovation. The innovation that you can actually, make money out of, for example. So how you get your rocket to Mars, that kind of innovation. And what that means is that it's become a very student-based business. When the cap on university students in the UK was lifted a few years ago, universities suddenly realized they've got this almost infinite number of students they could just pull in. Every student comes along with a bag of money, and the university can then take it and do what it wishes with it. It also discovered that in contrast to that part of it which is creating the new knowledge is actually very expensive to do and is not really reimbursed fully by government, but it's very expensive to do, especially the part that isn't exploitative. So you don't get any income in through that way. So your business model as this sort of kind of business thing is you get money out of students and you aim, as you do, as any company would do, to get as much money for as little cost as you possibly can. And then you have this other part of the university, which is kind of sort of almost left over from previous thought, is essentially very expensive, and you want to try it, but it's what gets you fame, and it's what actually brings you students. Students look at things like research rankings and all those sort of things as part of the process of choosing a university. So it becomes a marketing tool, a rather expensive marketing tool. And that means that the universities, and you've heard this very recently, start to think that the non-exploitable knowledge that they're creating is kind of not useful. And what that does is it puts an emphasis into STEM. And we have been hearing recently about how arts and humanities, for example, actually we should just get rid of them. We don't really need them at all. And we should just get rid of them because actually that's not really exploitable. We need, engineering, science, chemistry, medicine, that sort of stuff. Let's do that because that fits our business model. And that's kind of the model. The biggest problem of all is that the people who see themselves as running these universities are actually really rather poor quality business people. They're not that great at running businesses. They have, several universities have turnovers of well over £1 billion a year, and they have people who are basically incapable of running that kind of size of entity, running it. So it's poorly run, poor financial decision making, delivering degrees to students in a rather expensive way. So that kind of sense means what actually, if we wanted actually to think, how are we going to organize a university? It isn't the way we're doing it now. That seems to me absolutely obvious, that we can't really think about that. So in starting to think about that, what actually are we researching and how, and what are we actually teaching and learning and how? And that says to me, when I look at the world, I don't see the university model at all. I see the world is not made up of disciplines. The world is made up of challenges and problems and complexes and all of these sorts of, and ecologies and all these sorts of things. And actually the learning you need to be able to resolve the modern world is not driven by the kind of hard disciplinary boundaries that we are actually funneled into in university from a very funneling kind of school education system delivering into it. And so therefore we're trying to fit the world's problem into our model of subjects. And I always like to remember that the word subject means thrown under, as in thrown under the bus. So we throw a load of stuff into something and we call it a subject. But actually, the real problem we're trying to solve isn't like that. The real problem is actually how things come together and how they differentiate and how we can actually understand the interactions between things rather than necessarily know huge amounts about what the things are. You do need to know what things are, but the question is, how and when do you seek to acquire that? So I think really what we need for a world which is rapidly changing in ways that we are very unable to control, we need to be able to think rigorously, and we need to be able to think rigorously about anything in order to try and capture that rapid change in a way that we can begin to understand it and begin to be able to provide solutions. Climate change is a classic example where we have been able to understand the science for some time, and we understand the science. We have failed totally to communicate that to people who do not understand the science. And that seems to me one of the big failures of the university, because it is too much like an echo chamber within itself, and it is not used to having to talk to real people. I think we need to be able to be passionate and angry about the future. We are preparing the next world, and we should be actually thinking about how do we actually enable people to move into that world in a way that they will be able to survive as the world is changing. There isn't a set of answers that you kind of capture in your final degrees, that the life goes on from there. It's actually always going to be changing. So I have a sort of kind of model in my head of how this is formulated. What it would look like in a university, I think, is an interesting question. But I have a sort of acronym of which is SCREAM, because I think it's got a bit of the passion and the anger that we should have. So SCREAM. So the S is about science. The sort of kind of what I mean by science is the knowledge, the analytical methodology that enables us to be able to create the wisdom that we're talking about. And that is really basically about three things. Science is about the past, it's about the present, and it's about the knowledge that we're actually talking about, and doubt. Science is all about doubt. It's why it doesn't mix well with politics, because politics is about certainty. And so that's why politicians never understand scientists, and vice versa. The second one is C for creativity. We have to develop creativity if we're going to survive. And that is something which universities ought to be very able to do, irrespective of whatever pseudo subject we actually put it into. Being able to create is the essence of thought, and we should be able to do that. The third one, responsibility. If you create without responsibility, you end up with very bad things. And having that sense of responsibility about what you're creating is how we actually make sure that creativity is something which is exercised positively for the benefit of mankind and the planet and the universe, not irresponsibly. And then we need to be able to figure out, how do we put all these things together? So I use the word engineering for that, the expression of ingenuity to make things happen and make good things happen because of the responsibility, and to make innovative things happen because of the creativity. We need the arts in order to press the multisensoriality of the world, to understand how does time and rhythm and things come together to be able to create those new ideas. And the final one might actually surprise you a bit, but actually it comes out of my background, which is essentially music. Why music? Well, music is about the manipulation and bending of time, and how one actually manipulates that and understands how you can slow down time and speed it up to move on from the sort of Newtonian hegemony of clock time into the more organic sense of duration and movement of time and rhythm that actually enables us to be able to survive in that future world. So that's where I think we need to organize the university.
Not much to do there then, Nick. Wow.
Bravo.
I picked up one word in the middle of all that, which I'm going to use sort of facilitator's privileges to ask, which is that you talked about resolving a problem, or resolving it, and I wondered, and I'm picking up reflecting sort of work of Stafford Beer, whether dissolve rather than resolve would be a good word.
I think the Institution of Civil Engineers at one time used to have a strap line that said civil engineers solve problems. And I complained bitterly to them about that. I said, actually, yes, civil engineers are very good at solving problems. This is absolutely true. The problem is that they don't know which problems to solve. And so you end up solving the wrong problem. And I think in a way, your sort of dissolution as opposed to resolution is actually a really good way of thinking about that, that actually understanding the components better. This is the understanding of the problem that actually we need, and not to just take the problem at face value is actually really important. That's one of the reasons why actually artists are so great to have. You know, I work with artists and engineers, and the engineers will say, oh yeah, we fixed this problem, we know how to do it like this. And the artist says, don't really care about that problem, where we want to go is over there. And that's that, and getting those two things together is really amazing. When you really get it going, that's how we got the latency of a video transmission from 3 seconds to 30 milliseconds, is because of the artists. The engineers were quite happy with 3 seconds, and you still see it on the news. a 3-second latency. Getting it down to 30 milliseconds means that actors can perform in a play.
Yes.
They are on opposite sides of the planet. You can't actually perform music together in that form because musicians require a tighter latency. So we have to get it down to less than 10 in order to be able to get musicians to be able to play together. All those Zoom orchestras actually are all post-process. So that kind of thing comes from the arts. And so I think you're right, that this disillusion is a really good way of actually looking at that. And the best people to deal with disillusion actually are artists.
So if we ask the question about purpose, what is it we're trying to achieve? What's the outcome we're after? Then that gives us a clue to how we might go about delivering that.
Yeah.
So any quick questions for clarification or otherwise for Nick before we move on? Right, everybody
Yes,
else?
if nobody else is, if nobody else is, I'll have a go, because I mean, it's in the slightly embarrassing situation of agreeing 100%, Nick. I just thought, I mean, before you said music, I was thinking your presentation was music. I just thought, why aren't you the VC or something?
Never let me.
I'm sure they wouldn't. I'm absolutely sure. I want to speak up for the arts also, actually, because I think it's actually tragic the way in which the arts get covered in the press and in the kind of political debate and so on and so forth. And Leon was present when Vikas Shah presented to us at Loughborough fairly recently. Vikas being the founder of Thought Economics, which has interviewed some of the greatest minds on the planet on his kind of long form blog. And Vikas was very adamant and very determined that, in a sense, he made an argument which I can't put as eloquently as he did, but was basically to say that in a more dynamic world, you need more dynamic thinking. And that dynamic thinking, in a sense, pattern recognition, and in a sense, being able to absorb the colour and the changes and the variations of the work comes as much from art as it does from science. And I suspect then it's also not uncommon to have kind of people who are highly capable in different positions. A colleague of yours at UCL, I know, who's a very significant surgeon, is also a very significant music conductor, and so on. So I would just to highlight and put a flag in at this point, which is the arts is part of humanity. They're part of the space. They're part of how we understand the world. As Ezra Pound said, the antennae of the race, and let's accord them some respect.
Totally agree.
Thanks, Peter.
Totally agree with that.
Mustn't have too much agreement this afternoon. We didn't argue.
Yeah, it's dangerous. Dangerous. I'm agreeing with both speakers so far. Catherine, please.
Yeah, well, given that nobody knew what anybody was going to say before we started, that's either brilliant or disturbing. I'm not sure which at the moment. So Catherine and I, again, known each other for quite a long time, 10 years or more. Catherine has, if I remember rightly, PPE from Oxford, but I can't see the mask at the moment, Catherine, and subsequently became an accountant and had a career in industry until retiring, I can't remember, 12 months or so ago. She has commented somewhat acerbically from time to time on the content of my books, which is always good, just before they're published rather than after, which is really helpful, and on the nature of the world. So Catherine, over to you.
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you all, because I was listening to Nick and I agree with virtually everything he said as well. And actually, when I was looking, and I put myself very much in a position of society. I've tried to close off any academic or memories of student, but put myself in a position of society. But when I was looking at the whole thing, I was going, oh, and that, and then Nick said it, and I was thinking, oh, and that, and then Nick said it again. And I think what everybody has said about the importance of art, I totally agree. So I was asked to do this from the point of view of society. So I'm going to pretend that I am general society. And I made two assumptions. The first assumption is, if you want to organize something, you have to know what it's for, what's its purpose, who's it serving. And it can be what it does, but I think it goes beyond what it does. And my second assumption is that given that in the last 150, 160 years, there have been 3 big expansions of universities, they must be doing something right up until this point. And I think there are 3 core areas that I think we understand or need to understand what the purpose of a university is. 2 of them I think are fundamentally core, and both the speakers so far have actually touched on it. And then one of them I think perhaps starts to link in with some of the discussion that Liam was talking about things being a business. So the first one is these are centres of learning. And it's not just learning because you want to get from A to B, but it's learning for the sheer joy of learning, knowledge for its own sake. And that can be in STEM subjects, it can be history, it can be art, it can be music, it can be, you know, the whole lot of them. And I think that it's not just, you know, from society, that's a good thing in itself, but also that learning and that knowledge can take us somewhere. And particularly, I think it's easiest to describe in STEM terms, but you have universities as a centre of knowledge, a centre of research. And the best example I can think of is actually the one that we've all experienced in the last year, where the Jenner Institute at Oxford University actually came up very quickly with a vaccine for COVID. And not only that, I noticed they'd recently announced that they've come up with an anti-malarial, which in trials was 77% effective, you know, which is saving potentially hundreds of thousands of lives. So I think you can quite easily make a justification that universities are there to learn, whether that learning has a concrete output like the COVID vaccine, or whether it's just advancing human knowledge, which, you know, may or may not come in use at some point. And I think this is useful for universities, because if you've got acceptance from general society that there is a function there, even if perhaps some areas, you know, people are more enthusiastic about than others, it actually gives you quite a lot of influence and quite a lot of ability to shape things. Because not only are you one of the centres where that excellence and where that knowledge and where that expertise exists, but in principle, you have a more public profile than perhaps, you know, a business or a scientific laboratory or something. So you have a means of actually starting to express that to human beings, to, you know, society in general. The second area which Leon was talking about is actually about education. Purpose of the university, broadly speaking, is you produce young people who know how to think, they know how to learn, they're educated, they can think independently, they can apply critical analysis to problems, and universities disproportionately provide, you know, the leaders, the politicians, the civil servants, the teachers and the tutors, the innovators, etc., disproportionate proportion have actually been to university, have gone through that process. I think Leon, I think it was, said right at the beginning that in the first year, it's about education as a stepping stone to a career. And I know I read something fairly recently that Gavin Williamson was talking about further education as a whole, not just higher education, but he was talking about universities as being somewhere where you learn the skills you need to get a job, you improve your chances of job, you provide the skills that a country needs, you provide the skills that an employer needs, all of which is true. But to a large extent, it's not necessarily a university that has to provide that. I mean, certainly years ago, neither nursing nor policing were university, you know, you had to go to university to become them. You know, there was various training that you could do. So I think it's true that there is that element that Leon picked up on, you know, right at the beginning. But I think it goes beyond that. And I think that the point of learning is you get 3 years without any pressures, particularly if you're not bothered about what grade of degree you get. You get 3 years where you can explore, where you can go off and try new things. You can talk to different people who have different perspectives. You can learn how to learn, which is even more important. I mean, I remember when I was at university, I did PPE. I remember one term I decided that I would go and listen to the lectures on the history of military strategy, which has no use whatsoever in PPE, but was just interesting. And I learned some interesting stuff, which has been totally useless, to be fair, but it was very interesting. That if you don't use your university time to do that, then you come out, I think, not having got as much out of it as you should. And I don't know whether any of you know an Isaac Asimov story called Profession. It was written, I don't know, 65 years ago, but I would thoroughly recommend it to reading because I find it fascinating, because it is on the subject of learning and original thought and all this sort of thing. And I think that's one of the fundamental objectives of university. Those are the two key purposes. I think if you went to, if you like, the man or the woman in the street and asked them what university for, they'd probably say, you know, it's for not their knowledge, and it's to give my kids an education. I think there's a third area, and I don't think this is a key purpose. You know, if you were to design a university, I don't think you would put this as the #1 driver in what that university looked like. But I think it has some relevance. It's a sort of second order consequence. And that is, what did I call it? I called it something. Hang on, I'm just going to write down what I called it. I called it basically your economic and other ecosystem. So you have a university and they may well spin out, you know, a business to commercialize something that they've discovered. But actually, the really big thing about the ecosystem is you have 10,000, 20,000 students. You have the community of scholars that go with them, that are teaching them and are supporting them in their learning. And there are lots of them, and they're having an effect on the locality, on what it's like. And from an economic point of view, they all have to have somewhere to live. They all have to be fed. They have to be watered. They have to be entertained. They probably want to buy stuff, and that will create businesses to supply that. And then the people who come in to populate those businesses also need somewhere to live, somewhere to eat, somewhere to drink, and all the rest of it. So it's actually a way of bringing money into that community area. You know, it's a form of regeneration, if you like. The other area I think is interesting is I've called it cultural, and you know, it can be museums, art galleries, and that sort of thing. But I think it's also about the way that the community reacts and the way that the community changes. And it can be local. You know, we're a town or a city, and we have a university now. But I think there's, from a sort of national point of view, Britain has a very strong reputation in tertiary education around the world. That leads to soft power. So actually, the cultural element, and I know it's not quite the right word, but that cultural element is part of what I think is the purpose of a university, even though it's a second order one. So to summarize, I think you've got the education, and I think you've got the pursuit of knowledge, including knowledge just for the sheer hell of it. And then you've got these sort of second order consequences that come out of it. While I was thinking of it, some of the things that Nick had mentioned about whether universities are going in the right direction also occurred to me. Number one, how the bureaucratization, if that is a word, of tertiary education, that yes, they're big organizations and you need processes in place because no one individual can probably keep tabs on everything. But there's a point at which you're managing something, you're measuring something, you have a nice little list that you tick box. There's a point at which the bureaucracy itself becomes the point of the exercise. And I have concerns that universities are moving in that direction, and the things that Liam was talking about in terms of it being a business sort of seem to confirm that perhaps that's a risk. The other thing is, I worry that it's creating expectations, particularly among students, but expectations that can't be fulfilled. Well, you know, when I think most of us were at university, you go to university, you're there, you know, you're going to get a good professional job, and you're going to join the professional middle classes, and you're going to have your 2 holidays abroad each year and this sort of thing. That route isn't guaranteed anymore. At what point do students say, wait a minute, I'm paying £50,000 a year, £50,000 over 3 years, sorry, and you're going to give me a barista job? I don't like this, you know, and there'll be a response. And that is of a concern. And then there's another concern, and you'll know this better than I do, but I keep reading bits about the shutting down of dissident thought, quote unquote. If the point of a university is to explore knowledge and follow where it leads, you can't cut down the areas that someone doesn't like. Now, I don't know how big a problem this is because I'm not close to it. All I know is it's big enough that whether for culture war or other reasons, the government put it in the Queen's speech to have freedom of expression. I saw the day or two ago that I think it was Essex, but I may be wrong, university had to apologise to someone who'd been deplatformed because the deplatforming was in itself illegal. And, you know, if a university is not there for thought and to allow people to follow those thoughts, not only will we not discover all sorts of things, including, I don't doubt, the cure for cancer, but you'd have to ask the question, are you really a university? Or are you, I'm not picking on any religion in particular, a seminary or a madrasa where it's the learning of what is apt as opposed to the learning of what is there? So in conclusion, I think we would have to decide what the purpose of university is now, what the purpose of a university is going to be in the future, because if we only prepare for now, we'll very soon be out of date. And then bring these strands, and there may be a fourth strand, which is specifically around government policy, that you would bring in to decide, okay, this is what it is, this is what we're trying to do, this is its purpose, how do we best organise that? And I don't know the answer to that.
Thanks, Catherine. And I think if there was an answer, at least one of the assembled 20-odd people would know roughly what it is, at least, and I suspect it isn't out there. I was struck in the middle of that again. You were talking about the universities are there for learning, you know, about centres of learning and so on. And I wrote down, you know, the question is a university, however we sort of codify the thing that we keep calling a university, is it a store of knowledge in the same way that a pound is a store of notional value?
I mean, it is a repository because, you know, you've got the people there and they're writing their papers, they're doing their research, and it is a store of knowledge. I mean, I would hope it that, you know, if Oxford University are doing a certain amount of work on something and there's no proprietary element to it, I would hope they're not the only people in the entire country that has access to it, simply because it's, you know, it's the same way that books go to, what is it, 5 or 7 national libraries, you know, to make sure there's a copy of everything. So yes, it is a repository, and that's what you can leverage to actually have influence, because the government or whoever says, oh, we've got this problem, what should we do? And someone goes, ping, oh, I know somebody who was looking at that the other day.
Okay, so Mr. Bryant, you have your hand raised, I believe.
Yeah, I'd really be interested if they're happy to comment, the students, Tanya and Leon, as to how closely this sort of, what I'm going to provocatively call Dead Poets Society, Robin Williams kind of learning approach is real, and how much is, you know, a professor going through, you know, the lecture he delivered last year, and if he turns up to deliver the lecture, and how approachable the professors and people delivering the lectures are to questions that then get asked. So how much is it a place of learning, and how much is it a place of delivery of content, so they can get back to their research? And I do ask this based on having had 2 kids go through university. One's currently there and one's not there anymore and is in a profession.
So Tanya, Leon, over to you.
Sure, I can start then. In terms of my personal experience, in terms of the mixture of learning and just people who, and just lecturers who want to get it done with, it's sort of been a mixed bag. And I think the key distinction between those who obviously are there just because they have to give the lecture, they'd rather go back to their research. Those are the people that I've found, you know, tend to be less responsive to emails, are more likely to reuse slides from last year, even, you know, hide previous exam papers because they might reuse some of the questions. And in terms of the people who are found the most receptive, you know, you know how you could just generally tell enjoyment behind teaching based on tone of voice and everything. Those people, you know, are more responsive to emails, are more likely to teach, as Tanya was saying, holistically. You know, they're more likely to start waving their arms in the air like a preacher. They're less likely to talk about the slides. With one thing I remember, you know, there was a lecture where the whole lecture was 3 points, but the lecture lasted an hour because, you know, the lecturer was talking out of their heart, out of their genuine passion for the subject. So, you know, and I've heard complete other stories from other people. Some people generally loving their professors where, you know, every single lesson is something great, and other people going, you know, they're there for a job, I'm here for a degree, screw it.
Tanya, thanks, Leon.
Yes, thank you for that. I'm not as far in my degree as Leon, so I have more limited experience in that sense. But from my experience, I think what I've noticed is there is a shift in the stimulus. So along the journey of education, when we are in the younger years and not in the tertiary sector of education, often the stimulus from the teachers. So the teachers are attempting to actively engage the students in the content. I think the difference at university is, from my experience, my lecturers are willing to help me as much as the desire I hold to seek help from them. So there's less of a almost spoon feeding or less of a initiation from the lecturer's side. It needs to come from the curiosity and the degree of curiosity from the student. So from my experience, my lecturers have been wonderful. I share a really good rapport with many of them. However, I do notice this is a big factor. And in addition to that, I think means to, I think you pointed out about content delivery versus learning and returning to research. I think the lecturers really put a lot of effort. The very fact they're a lecturer, I think, suggests a very strong interest and a very strong passion towards learning, which is often conveyed. However, this might be dampened at times, and this would largely be due to the reciprocation of interest from the students. So I think it all comes down to very much the students' attitudes and how enthusiasm and only so much self-initiated effort an individual, as in the lecturer, can put in. There needs to be that reciprocal element, which from my experience as a business student has sometimes been missing in lectures. Of course, stemming from the fact that many students view their degree not as an opportunity to learn, to really gain a multidisciplinary approach to learning, but as a means to get from A to B, which is to get a job.
Hi.
Yeah.
I've had quite a bit of experience being a student in universities and other places, and what I absolutely was interested in was when I went to the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago as a fresher, there were often several parallel courses, the same course by different teachers, and the students who had been there before knew who were the ones, the different teachers and their different styles. So there were some who just almost taught by rote, and there were others who were completely inspirational and things. So, but in all of the universities and colleges and experience I've had in the UK, there's never been that situation. The teacher is the teacher, is the professor is the professor who does that, and that's it. So there's no choice. But the difference of styles and the way that the effect that has on your learning, whether it fits your style or it doesn't, is absolutely huge.
Thanks, Genevieve. That's actually really interesting. I mean, I guess British universities are relatively small compared to many of their American counterparts, and looking at what's going on in some of them at the moment, they're getting smaller at a fair old rate, at least as far as the ability to teach is concerned. They seem to be acquiring more administrators, though, so that's probably not a good thing, I would suggest. Okay, if there are no immediate more questions at this point, the plan and I stress it's the plan, it's sort of mine and Peter's plan, feel free to change it, is to break ourselves up into, I think with the numbers we've got, let's say 3 breakout rooms. If the numbers keep going down, we'll make it 2, and talk about what we've heard, push your own ideas and thoughts and challenges into that, and then in about 45 minutes or thereabouts to come back together as a group, share what we've been talking about in our individual breakouts, and then see if there's something sensible or not to synthesize out of the end of it. Does that appeal as a way of working? That's sort of kind of question 1. If everybody's happy to go down that route. The request is several-fold. One is we're going to make the groups happen randomly, so you'll end up in whatever group you end up in, and I have no meaningful control, which is great. So would you introduce yourselves to each other when you get together? Would one of you in each group please volunteer to take some notes and share thoughts at the end? Okay, I think everybody should be more or less back now. I've got no idea off the top of my head it was in which room. I know Tanya is going to feedback from one group. Have we got 2 other people who are prepared to share?
I'll give it a go.
Please will give it a go. Genevieve, you have your hand up as well again, the idea here is share your thoughts, share your thinking, what went on in your session. We'll then, I'll call it collapse into a general conversation afterwards, which will hopefully between us try and distill something sensible out of it all. But, that's the way it goes. So Genevieve, if you'd like to speak first, that'd be great. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Indeed. We had a very interesting discussion in our group, and to try and do justice to it, we noticed, especially at the end, that there was huge pressure now for young people coming into the teaching profession in the universities and things, to just follow the line and not be innovative. Very, very difficult to find the opening to be doing that. And that Nick, for example, Nick Tyler had worked very consistently in his department to try and bring in new lecturers at the beginning stage who were open to be more flexible and that kind of thing, and had worked with them to try and get them to be really thinking about what they were doing. They had actually changed the curriculum very substantially. I'm looking around for the other people in the group. Where are we? Ben Sweeting was particularly talking about the architecture and how they are working much more in the context and not getting people to really consider the implications for the town or whatever that they're going to be working in, how they need to get it really appropriate to meet the needs. Where's the other one? Let's see. She's gone. Okay. We had one from the Netherlands, Open University from the Netherlands, who was also doing some very interesting stuff. I brought in from my Moody days when on the first day we had to choose which lecturer we wanted for our classes, and the students who'd been there before absolutely knew the different teaching styles, and there were some who just went on for you learn this, you learn that, you learn the other, and that's it, and you come back with the exact answers. Or there were others who were much more thought provocative and that kind of thing. So you got to choose the teachers that went best with your style as far as you could. And then later on, we were talking about York briefly, that because I've just been researching about it, that the Archbishop of York, Archbishop Temple during the war wanted to have a university in York. And when I was a schoolgirl, 15, our curate said, we think we should have a university in York. Why York? Well, York was the capital of England for a while. And even in the 700s, they had art and learning and things at that kind of high quality, and therefore that was why there was a real appreciation of learning there. Anyway, I haven't really done that justice, everybody justice. I'm sorry about that. Done my best. Thank you.
Genevieve.
One of these by now, wouldn't you? Anybody want to add anything to that from that group before we move on? Anything that
I could add just one thing. One of the bits I found interesting in our conversation was around kind of the notion of establishment, and we talked about UCL as an example, just because that was I think common to a couple of us, and how when it's established, it Nick, correct me if I get some of this wrong, but it's sort of established in opposition to Oxford and Cambridge, and in a more tolerant religious stance and so on. So in some sense, it kind of very much sees itself as an institution, as, you know, a bit as the new kid on the block still, even though it's quite old, and also as able to kind of speak out against power and so on. But also it's, you know, part of the establishments. It's a different kind of establishment to government and religion and so on. And so this creates some paradoxes in its within itself. And I guess that's one of the things of the university's place, is it's partly establishment and partly place of anti-establishment thinking of some kind.
So is there something there, Ben, about one of the things that we would want in organising our university is somehow or other the freedom to speak its truth to power?
Yeah, I was actually thinking that the paradox for me is that it's very easy to concentrate on that freedom, and we kind of had a very content-oriented discussion today. It's very easy for a university not to notice and take responsibility for its own the ways it is powerful. And I think, you know, it sets an establishment or a practice, a way of doing things. That's how we got into talking about how, you know, lecture courses that easily last for 35 years and so on in some cases. So but even if you don't, you know, it's just everything you say as an academic kind of has a lot more weight, and the university gives its credence to even events it hosts from the outside and so on. So I was thinking more in terms of like a self-critical, how the university is kind of, you know, critiques its own is critical about the consequences of its own actions. And this is not an I feel, I'm sorry, we're quite away from organisation as a question, but we're mainly talking about what the purposes are as set up from before. So
I think you're absolutely on the form of organisation when you say that, because actually it's about how the people that give the institution life interact to give it a life that has value and meaning in society. If we talked a bit about bureaucracy, as one inevitably does. So who's going to speak from the other group? I know, Tanya, do you want to go next, and then we'll pick up the third one? Are you happy with that?
Yeah, I'm happy to go next. So we had a few questions that we were talking around in our group. So one of the questions was in relation to what was said previously as part of the wider group. So it seems that there are two ways we can look at this issue of bureaucracy and all about learning. So the first one is, how do we increase the incentive for lecturers to show as much interest in the part of teaching and delivering learning as they do with their research? And secondly, how can students, particularly undergraduates, give back to their lecturers? Because of course the student receives a lot from the lecturer in terms of learning. However, how can they offer their contribution back? And we sort of had a discussion wherein it emerged that the notion is that lecturers are like a slave in a galley, because they have to operate on the basis of output. They have to operate on the basis of efficiency. And they're expected to teach a curriculum over which they have no control. And therefore, perhaps an approach to explore would be to have lecturers answer, ideally lecturers should answer questions on the basis of context as opposed to the content of books, which is what's happening currently, because of course students can very much do independent learning just by regurgitating textbooks. So a few approaches we thought we could implement was, number one, how can students give back? Well, they can own their learning. They can really enrich the discussion amongst their peers. So perhaps they could form learning cliques wherein students come together and they have discussions about the subjects themselves. And therefore this in turn would enrich the discussion within the classroom environment. Another way we could tackle this is by the educator actually putting in their contribution. So researchers bringing in the lecturers who are part researchers as well, making the contribution and bringing in their research into the classroom, as opposed to just staying very stringent to the curriculum that is being taught. And another means that students could really stimulate the sort of interest from the lecture side would of course be to inquire about their research. Now, of course, it's appreciated at times, this may be viewed as burdensome, but equally, you know, there's nothing to be lost. It's worth a try. So having that real curiosity towards the lecturer's research activities will really facilitate the lecturer's interest in delivering the teaching. And another question we kind of raised was, sorry, just bear with me, there's a lot of notes. And this was about how can we inspire argument within lectures, so making them more interactive. And the idea is to allow lecturers to teach, again, what they enjoy. So if people are teaching something they're passionate about, that by default will change the style of delivery and make it more engaging. So the question was also the fact, why is it that the current system, so bureaucracy was a big issue, we discussed bureaucracy. How can we perhaps tackle bureaucracy? And it emerged that bureaucracy isn't all bad. To a degree, bureaucracy is very good because that's how humans and mankind organize their affairs. However, the issue here is when the issue occurs when there's a lack of clarity in the purpose of the bureaucracy and what it's delivering to the beneficiaries. And this is the issue because this has become a grey area. For instance, I believe John mentioned that the distance between the vice chancellor and the undergrad student is huge. And often this is obscured by the system because the inequalities aren't recognized. So it's about really changing the focus from what is being done to how does this affect the students. And therefore, by default, that will impact the way teaching is delivered. So it's not just a case of we need to tick the boxes, that these are less of a results-based approach and more of a, perhaps a bit more of a empathetic approach for the student. So I believe we came to the conclusion that it's really about how do we use contemporary technologies to sustain the bureaucracy, yet eradicate the negative influence and consequences it creates. And I think we also added that the less visible bureaucracy is, the more effective it is. as well. And so it's really about being able to empower students to identify not what the person is saying they're looking for, but rather what they actually are looking for. So this is the error that's being made in the system. For instance, perhaps an example of this would be, obviously people say what they're looking for. It often differs to what they're actually looking for. So being able to read between the lines will really facilitate dampening the negative effects that come with the system. And I believe that is pretty much it. I hope that kind of makes sense. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Tanya. So David and Leon and Richard, you were in that group. Anything significant to add?
Excellent summary.
Pretty jolly good, I thought. Thank you. And so the third group, I've got no idea who's the spokesperson for the third group.
I got volunteered, John.
Oh, well done.
Catherine voted me. So thank you. So just to try to summarize, I'm going to put it into 3 containers: past, present, and future. Starting with the past and some of the recollections we had over our time at university, I think one could maybe say 2 things. First of which is some things seem to be lost from there. Some things that were fine now are not fine as we look at them, and you know, there has been some change, and people talked about the passion for the subject and the way in which this was a kind of this was the social interaction between the student body. But then, of course, we concede that times were different then, and maybe 3% went to university and jobs were guaranteed. So students didn't have to worry about the instrumental power of their degrees. That was already baked in. So the second point we would make in relation to the past is it's not a reliable indicator of the present or the future. And therefore, although you know, it seemed important to talk about it, we don't know what we can draw from it into today. Then when we talk about the present, dissatisfaction, I think, I would say, I think many notes of dissatisfaction. You know, perhaps we are the result of a political agenda to expand university education. Perhaps we got the wrong structure by turning polytechnics into universities, and perhaps we didn't accord technical colleges with the esteem they deserved in an overall system of education, and we made everything a kind of monoculture of universities. All of these kind of perhapses, you know, perhaps the academic job has been changed and turned into something overly performance measured, and perhaps we have a system of finance that loads all the risk onto students and potentially some future risk onto future taxpayers as a black hole develops around student payments. So over the present, just dissatisfaction. Many perhaps is all adding up to dissatisfaction. So finally to the future. And to the future, we talked about is AI part of the future, and some debate over that. In the end, I think there tended to be an accord, which was to say it's overrated. But B, some other form of disruption. I think, though it wasn't the main topic, it was significant in the conversation, and there seemed to be some accord that some sort of disruption would happen. And then a potential C, which is there anything from the past that might come back to the future, kind of a rediscovery of some of the things that we miss from the past being found in the future. Again, we don't know, and that's it.
So interesting. So my first political engagements were as a sort of teenage boy with I can't remember, 1973 or 74, when we had sort of multiple general elections in the same year. And then, so for 40-ish years, we've had a particular let's call it economic strategy for want of any better way of describing what's gone on since about 1978, 79, where a capitalistic form of economy has dominated and has been, let's say, absorbed by the thinking of the people who use universities, so that we perhaps end up with many of the things that you describe. It's about efficiency, it's bureaucratic, it's teaching the stuff that's in the book so that people can learn and regurgitate and be tested against the things that we've already decided are valuable. But actually the point of the university has been to preserve itself, and that's what it has perhaps become. Is that what you are, not just you, Peter, but others, is that what seems to be being said at the moment? And the floor is open, so yeah, shout in. Ben.
I think we just need to be a bit careful here where we're verging onto curriculum design and we're making lots of generalizations about this. So we're kind of, I think, assuming a bit of a straw man of what curriculum design is in institutions. So I'm speaking from the inside. It might be that I'm speaking from a polytechnic perspective, which everyone seems to be, basically everyone's comments seems to be that they would like to reinvent the polytechnics again. And I know we go through cycles of this. And it might be that I'm from an architectural perspective and we missed the 20th century in terms of pedagogy. So we have some different things going on, which is generally has a lot of advantages, although some disadvantages. But I kind of think, like, you know, a lot of these things are curriculum design, and academics do or can do these things if they're encouraged to. This is what we try and do in our underfunded, you know, under-resourced institution where I work, and we do them quite well without many assets. I don't see why other places can't do this. I think the idea of just teaching what's in a book sounds nuts. I mean, what are they doing? There's no reason why anyone has to do that. You're totally in charge of developing your own curriculum. You have to take responsibility for these things. So I think either there's some really bad stuff out there that I don't know about, or like we're just being, I think, a bit too what am I saying? I think maybe we shouldn't be aiming at curriculum design so much. I kind of think we got to look at if we're talking about organization, then it's what are the levels of organization that are, you know, restrictive or difficult of that. So I could say that, you know, I can redesign these curriculums that are really exciting and do kind of everything that's in 10 years summary, but the consequences of that is you get under pressure for the amount of money you're spending on tuition in order to establish that, right?
So to what extent is resource a genuine constraint on the way that you can operate then?
It's a big constraint on the way I can operate. So and I think that, you know, you have made the point to me, I can't remember if you did it earlier, about, oh, universities are dreadfully inefficient because da da da. Nick made the point about, well, they're very expensive ways to give people degrees. And again, I think this just needs locating in particular institutions. So I think it's very different. You can look in the league tables about spend per student and student staff ratio, and you can see that some places have twice as many staff as the other places, but we're all, certainly in my subject, we're all scrutinized, independent, massively scrutinized by professional bodies, and it's all level, right? So actually this is because there's more research money in some places, there's other kinds of funding. I think efficiencies could be made, but efficiencies could be made as putting people like me on sessional contracts and doing less thinking. I'm worried about an efficiency perspective on this, although I think it could be more efficient. But it doesn't mean I haven't got it can be inefficient and you can have pressure on resources. These are different things. It depends what resources you've got, I think.
I think that's my point, Ben, is that the pursuit of efficiency is in some sense is fatuous in the context of a university if we've defined the outcome the wrong way. So if what we're after is you know, really effective education, and we can decide what we think that means, then we can think about what efficiency means in the context of delivering a really effective education. And I think that's the problem at the moment, is the measurement is all around how much of what did you do to whom, rather than what was the benefit of what you did with that group of people. And that's where we get that distortion.
we have a lot of conversations about savings, but not so many conversations about planning. And it's always unclear what we're saving against what and really what we're trying to do. And actually, it's not the university's fault. It's all really structural. It's the fact that we're in a architecture's in a price group where you don't get top-up money, but you're really expensive. Various other subjects are in this. And it's just really hard at that level, you know, you just don't have enough income to do what you're trying to do well. So you're just, if you keep trying to do that, either you just end up in a load of arguments, or you end up having to slice stuff off, you know, slice off the stuff we're talking about.
Thanks,
and
Ben.
that's the government.
James, you'd like to come in?
Yeah, I'm kind of a little bit confused, because the sort of the end of the beginning of the discussion for me personally is, what sort of learning environment do we want to create? You know, what are we actually trying to do? And then, you know, the curriculum and the structure and the universities and everything fall under that umbrella. And we're talking about sort of how do we redesign a university, but you know, the universities are designed for the existing context they find themselves in. Unless we change the context, you'll still end up with a university, but with a few of the chairs shuffled around on the deck. On the deck. And if, I mean, in our group, we were saying pretty much that we expect the university structure as is to be disrupted. I personally think it will be significantly disrupted by new players in the market that will blow the model out, because all the research into how organizations fall apart, or how group organizations fall apart, is that they realize too late. It's the sort of boiled frog scenario. They realize too late, and by the time they begin to change, they are already disrupted and they are already failing. So what, you know, if the, and I keep using the spectre of Google, but if the likes of Google come along and they have, we've got a better idea, we're going to set up a structure like this, and that actually works and is disruptive, the universities are going to be running around like headless chickens, trying to save their lives. But they exist for the reason that they're in a context which won't change unless either A, we can change it, the government, the people, whoever can change it, or Google or the likes come on and make it change.
I think that's already happening, James. And what I'd say is the context has changed multiple times in the time I've worked in universities, and the government has intentionally created an environment in which it's difficult for a university to organize itself. That's how I would characterize it. And it's done it intentionally in order to, because it has some half thought through ideas about actually wanting to get rid of some things it can't quite identify, right? And it's never quite clear what they are, right? But it kind of has some, it wants to make it a market because it thinks that markets are good. And it's created something which is really unstable. So actually you just can't plan for the next year because you don't know what your income is, and you're really dependent on each year's income. This isn't even complicated, you know, intellectually driven planning stuff. You cannot get a budget for the next year before you're halfway through that year. That's when you know your budget. You've spent half of it before it's given you, because that's the funding cycle the government's put you on. And unless you've got shitloads of, loads of income from other streams to compensate for that, it's just a really unstable environment. So you have to design I have to have the curriculum signed off January for modules that start in September, but you don't really know what your budget is till the January after you've taught it.
Yeah, I was a governor of a sixth form college, and they really are in the same sort of cycle, and that they've got the same, it's obviously not identical, but the same sort of manacles or shackles or whatever.
It's a bit like
it's a nightmare. It is a nightmare.
It's a bit like the government. Another Tory report was that, well, they did a report on cities, and they decided that it'd be great if we had more you know, Oxford and Cambridge were really nice places to live and everywhere else wasn't. So everyone should moved to Oxford and Cambridge, right? That was an urban proposal, and that's kind of their university proposal too, and it doesn't make sense.
But it's okay because they're joining them up with a new railway now, Ben, so it'll all be fine. Tanya had her hand up, and then David, please. Tanya.
Thank you, John. So from what it seems, of course, James mentioned about the context designed and the fact that universities seem to just be pragmatic. They're developing to the context around them. So does it not seem more appropriate to say that the answer to changing the context would be in changing mindsets? So to which there is some sort of link to parenting, to student attitudes that are developed through the course of their learning journey, as opposed to just at the end. Because of course, university is an end for many in the path of learning. And as a result of that, that means the sort of notions, the values and the attitudes they've had through their journey of learning have almost been crystallized and are difficult to change. So really my question is, obviously it's far, far more difficult to change the way an organization works than the entity itself. And of course, when we think about the scale of which the educational system is operating, do you think the solution lies more in the more abstract factors such as student attitudes developing throughout the course of their learning journey, perhaps parenting? Do you think it lies more in the intangible sort of factors such as attitudes, in essence, is my question.
Okay. Well, starting by addressing your question, Tanya, I see part of what's if you want to know how to organise a university, top down, you've got to address the civil servants and the departmental policies in whatever they call the civil service organisation, running and setting the sort of assessment criteria for universities. Bottom-up stuff does happen, and it does tend to make people nervous, but if you can field it, it's pretty good. Going on to what Ben was saying about unstable funding, back in the 70s, we had this word quinquennium, which meant that the universities got a grant for 5 years so that they would know and be able to plan for that, which is, you know, possibly something that we should look at returning to. In terms of, you know, whether Google or whatever, the university is going to collapse, to me, their unique selling point is a good seminar. 2 of my seminar leaders as an undergraduate were excellent. 2 didn't really know what they were doing, and you can there's scope for developing lecturers' skills in eliciting things from people. Also, my experience in organising a university a long time ago is that although ostensibly professors and deans run the university, don't underestimate what their gatekeepers are doing. When I needed access to a copyright library at Cambridge, I realised that the letter signed by my professor was actually written by his PA secretary. Running a students' union, I found that I didn't really need to talk to the deans of the university. If I came to their ostensible gatekeepers, the 5 PAs for the deans of the university, and I charmed them, the deans were sort of sufficiently likely to sort of go along with what their PA said if it didn't drop them near. My other point is that as someone who's been in schools a long time, I generally say in these conversations, I have nothing to say because I've got far more experience of schools than the rest of you as an inspector, etc. There is so much diversity, and I think within subjects and across universities, there may be diversity and there may be success sort of recognised there. I mean, clearly some things are going right. We want to identify the weak points and hopefully, you know, we grow and we regrow, and what you can do with one group of students is different from what you can do and ask of another group of students. Some students need more support, some come extremely coherent, some develop that after a few years.
So we need to become much more responsive to the people that we're engaging with, is one of the threads that's coming out of that for me. So actually the bureaucracy, Tanya, needs to become more responsive rather than be got rid of, might be a way of describing it. Nick, you're looking very thoughtful.
Yes, I think that one of the biggest constraints on me right now is the conservatism of the university administration, who are that's where the gatekeepers really are. So I find that whereas a few years ago, I think it would be fair to say that the UCL was kind of run by the academics, it certainly no longer is. And I'm not necessarily saying that all universities should be run by academics or anything like that, but I think because in the end it doesn't matter if the vision and the strategy are right. It doesn't really matter about that, and academics aren't necessarily the best people for running things. But what happens is it becomes very cautious and very risk averse. And I think, in a sense, one of society's needs of universities is that they can be not risk averse. That's the place where society can test things, and sometimes literally. But this is where you should be able to have the debates, and the development of that future generation is about creating the next stage of society. And that for that you need to be able to ask the questions that are difficult, and the establishment doesn't want those questions answered because it's too busy establishing itself. And if the establishment creeps into the university and starts to control it, then the university becomes frigid, and that is a big danger. And I've found that really to unlock that one has to become very subversive and force things through that they don't quite, which is quite fun in a way, but we have to do things in a way that enables such opportunity to arise before you necessarily know what the opportunity is, and that way it is possible to be able to generate that new world and the excitement, and that then stimulates the education and the development, if you like, of creativity and so on for the future. And it seems to me that the organization of the university needs to be sort of malleable and dynamic, rather than rigid. And we need to be able to get that back. I think that's actually really important, because in the end, that's where you're going to get your creative teaching. As Ben says, I mean, architecture and engineering, they're two examples of heavily regulated subjects. They're regulated outside the university by professional institutions. And so there's a whole pile of diktat from that, which is, I mean, I'm not necessarily criticizing it. I'm fine with it. I can live with it. It gives me enough freedom to be able to do things. But you then have another row of process on it, which is about how you deal with whatever. You can almost name it, and it will be a list of things. Regulations for examinations, regulations for courses, what can be in your curriculum, which is simply coming out of the bureaucracy of the university, not from the subject or the subject area or its history or its future or whatever. And I think that kind of flexibility is really important.
Those kind of, I guess, quality processes is probably what they'd be called here. I think I find them really interesting. Well, I find them really interesting because often what I perceive is that teaching gets aligned to processes that are easy to quality assure.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think the whole learning outcome thing, which learning outcome constructivist alignment, move in assessment, it's sort of, my experience is like, it's just very easy to bureaucratize because you can trace it all through. And it doesn't seem to me to be particularly constructivist or aligned. So, but it's quite hard to, so I developed like very different approaches to this, but they're kind of heretical in, you know, it's like, what, you didn't do that. You don't assess against the learning outcomes, you assess against the task.
Yeah.
You know, this is very hard to maintain because everyone's, you know, the culture's a certain way.
It's what I mean about being subversive.
Yeah.
And one of the things I find is actually teaching students to be subversive is actually really quite useful and helpful, and I think actually very good for society.
So I'm quite interested in subversive QA processes, and I'm sort of trying to, you know, for instance, you have to do these reports, but I'm sort of more interested in, I was trying to get people to do them visually as rather than writing now. That's what I'm going to try and move to, just sort of, but I think that a lot of these processes, they end up, what they actually are is moments to reflect on your own practices, but what they say they are is ways in which to report on various issues, but they don't, you just end up noticing the things you can't change every year, and it's very hard to change the things you can't change, but there is no, it's also really hard to get someone else to change them too, somehow. And I'm sure there's some probably clever thing about VSM that would explain this to me, but it's like you pass it up to the next level of recursion, right? If that's the right word. But at that kind of level of the discussion, it no longer matters. So I pass up that, you know, the windows don't open in a particular studio space, but the windows don't matter at the next level. They only matter at my level. So you actually never, it's kind of impossible to, the window is not opening doesn't become about the quality of the studio space. It becomes about the price it would cost to maintain the building properly, right? So I just don't know how you ever, yeah, I think it's very very difficult to change the things you can't change.
So I think we have a tendency, a risk of reducing the things that we evaluate to the things that are easy to evaluate and do consistently, rather than the things that are actually perhaps important to either the student or society at large when the student's finished. Malcolm, you've been waiting very patiently, my friend. Do you want to come in?
Right. I don't know where to start now, because I almost want to comment on all the last few contributions.
You've got 15 minutes.
Okay, right. Well, let me just start. Maybe a misunderstanding, but this is called, isn't it, How to Organise a University. Now, I've been sitting here thinking how to design a university. So straight off, I'm thinking of organisation in terms of design. Now, I've been reading some of Ben's stuff about design, mainly because I'm a business architect. So I don't build structures, but I sort of build informational structures. So I found some of that stuff really interesting. And there's a quote, because I was actually a Paul Pangaro article I came across recently. He's quoting Gordon Pask, and he talks about structures make sense as part of larger systems that include human components, and the architect is primarily concerned with the larger systems. So if we were to kind of think of a university, not in terms of bricks and mortars, but as an informational architectural structure, what is its larger systems? And this also relates to what Ben said a minute ago about recursion. So in other words, right, if one looks at the architecture of education, if you like, as an informational construct in its embedded environment, what then? And this is, I think Tanya might have gone, but Tanya was, I think, on those lines when she started talking about parenting even. I'd never even thought of that, because I was actually going to think of it more in terms of, what about politics? What about Gramsci's idea of ideological hegemony? What about the incentives we talked about in our breakout that creates this publishing thing where you just have to publish any old rubbish in order to get your points? What about the kind of tick box culture that seems to be driven by an outcome-based common sense? What about the future? Again, Peter Kavalak did this in a summary because we touched upon growing automation. Now, I don't think this is going to reduce jobs. I mean, there's a book out there that sounds tremendous fun called Fully Automated Luxury Communism. But what I think that's going to mean is that there will actually then be much more ideas about a university basic income. There'll be things like, what about emotional labor? What about caring labor? What about intellectual labor? What about labor in the arts? So I think that there is a sense here of, this comes right back to, I think, one point somebody said a minute ago, I think it was Nick. This kind of means then, if we're going to be thinking about how to organize a university, we've got to look at the big picture and then think about adaptability. How is it going to be flexible and adapt? Now, I have no idea what those answers might be, because I think the actual political, ideological environment we're in at the moment is quite toxic and almost barbarian. But I think they are the questions to ask.
I'm just writing down barbarian. I'm just writing down barbarian, Malcolm. The first time that's been used this afternoon. So, David.
Yeah, I mean, a perfect system will sooner or later need changing, and you tend at the lower levels of bureaucracies to have people doing certain things, and they tend to want to go on doing certain things, just as people after a certain age like to go on making the same point ad infinitum. And I think people within, it's not only about the structure, it's about the skills of individuals. You can recognize, if you ask the most senior bureaucrat in a university, if they see repetition in their job, they'll say, no, it's different all of the time. I used to get a perverse pleasure, though, with the lower level bureaucrats in getting them to do something differently, which is probably why I didn't get a good degree. But you need a decent theory of mind of the person at the top of the particular hierarchy. You need to be aware that there are divisions and tensions within any bureaucracy which you can exploit in order to change these things. But all these things take time, and you may prefer to sort of spend your time thinking about something more general and abstract. To me, there's an interaction between the practical and the abstract, but that isn't the only way to sort of make progress in your career. But I think change is always possible. You can change things at the bottom. You can be sort of blocked if you're at the sort of top of the pyramid.
So you've all been making me think about the notion of self-organization. So if we move away a little bit from the idea of university as organization in the sense of institution, and we think about university as community, does that shift? I mean, setting aside the business model and all that complicated stuff that we'd have to deal with, what does university as community start to look like if it's floating around with the sort of the challenge of what was it Nick said? I did write it down. Creating the next generation of society. I think it was a word to that effect, Nick. So if we think of university as community rather than organisation, does that shift the way we think about it? Tanya, you had your hand up.
Excuse me. Yes, just to add to what David said and what you just said, I think very much so. If you think about it, what constitutes an organization? It's the people. The people. What even is the system and the structure and the very system we're talking about, it constitutes people. And I think David made an excellent point about understanding the theory of the mind of the people at the top and then exploiting that. So there's an element of psychology to it. But what seems really strange to me is that everybody feels that there seems to be this notion of we cannot really make a change as individuals, as a community, because we have to succumb to the system. And if you really go down to the root of it, the system is made of us, the people. The system is what we give definition to it. And therefore, I think there's been the role of many individuals who have chosen to second this notion of the fact that I have to comply with the system that has really brought us to this point today. So as you said, John, what if we shift that thought to thinking that we are a community of intellectuals, of individuals who have the ability to choose to do things, even if slightly differently. I think all of that will really, it will have the snowball effect and be able to cause a change in the zeitgeist, which is of course the spirit of our time. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that? Because how can we really, how do we think it would benefit us shifting the emphasis from being just an organization to a community?
Who wants to come in there? Two
Is
participants
this-
got hands raised. Peter, you've got a hand raised.
Yeah, so isn't this where universities started, as academic colleges, as communities, as bodies self-governing initially, and then becoming institutionalized along the way, and moving to different forms of resources coming in has allowed, you know, in a sense, other influences in what universities are and how they're organized. So I really like it. I really like what's being said, but and well, no but about it, but just to say, is it feasible in the modern world?
So I think, is it feasible in a modern world? Yes, because we're being it. I think we are being university in the conversation that we're seeking to have.
I agree, actually.
I think Tanya flagged that up sort of
Yeah.
earlier in the conversation, and I think Leon also mentioned it. The challenge would be, how do we make it something that external to this community of 16 people is perceived to have validity in a sort of in a wider world, and how do we sort of shift from that to something else? So feasibility is a function of back to Tanya's point. Yeah, what did we ask for? And at the moment, if what we asked for is the sort of bureaucratic, centralized teaching machine that universities are in danger of becoming, even if they're not there yet, then you know, how do we, picking Tanya's point, disrupt that?
Yeah, it's a great point of. It's a beautiful point, actually. Yeah.
It is, but I think part of it is that the people within the institutions are to some extent trapped by them because they're rewarded within the system as it currently stands, and they risk that reward by being too disruptive. Difficult to sack academics, but there is an element of you know, when I was a banker, they said to me, you either get out by the time you're 35 or you stay till the end of your career, because once you pass 35, you won't be able to afford to leave, because your sort of golden handcuffs become far too valuable at that point, which is sort of bit of that with universities. David, you've got your hand up again.
Yeah, as I said in my talk about trees a few months ago, organizations purport to be hierarchies, but they tend in reality to be semi-lattices. And I suggest you go on Google Images and look up semi-lattices. The point is there's sort of cross links. One thing which dictatorships try and do is divide, divide, divide. But you actually get little communities nested and, you know, interacting around all over the place. And that's one of the elements of getting a more flexible organization. And I do believe that organizations do redesign themselves an awful lot of the time at various levels. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Malcolm, then Ben, then Leon.
Oh, right. I thought I was not quite next. I think what was being talked about there in some ways is this idea of boundaries. So where do you draw the boundary? And then also when you think of it in terms of how do you pass information in and out of that boundary? And it kind of, I mean, if you look at my backdrop here, you might just be able to see right in the middle, that's an orangutan. Now, that's an orangutan actually in the Borneo rainforest, but where is the boundary we're looking at there? Do we look at the single animal or the whole ecosystem? So what is the kind of like the ecosystem of a university? And one of the things that did occur to me, it was the very first thought I jotted down. It goes right back to Leon. I think Leon seemed to be correct me if I'm wrong, but seem to be suggesting that universities perhaps need to be more business focused. Maybe not, but that's what I jotted down. Now, for me, I think there's a little bit more of a paradox. I think they need to be less business focused, but have more real world input. And if I can sort of perhaps get at that, I mean, I was talking in our breakhouses that whereas my career, I did a degree in English, but it was very multidisciplinary. I started but didn't finish a PhD, which was mainly on sociology. I then did an MSc in human computer interaction. Then I became a business architect, and now I think that would really be useful to rethink how you might study literature from a design perspective. But I feel as if there's no way for me to get that back into the universities. And I almost feel as if there is a sense of, shouldn't there be some more, even just these little tweaks, these little levers where universities go and perhaps, a bit like maybe the civil service, academics spend 6 months being a business architect, and then a business architect go and be a visiting lecturer for a term. And I feel as if it's this idea of actually just in that systems idea of what is the ecosystem, where do you draw on the boundary, and how do you pass information between in and out of that boundary.
Thanks, Malcolm. Really interesting. Ben?
Yeah, I really like the semi-lattice kind of, that kind of makes a lot of sense in my experience. It reminds me of that, and something someone was saying before, it reminds me of someone talking about approach to organizational change, which was kind of going from the top and the bottom at the same time. So you get buy-in from the people at the top, you kind of work with people at the bottom, and you gradually squeeze out the middle management. And then when I think of that, makes a lot of sense, because this middle layer is often the most conservative bit. And then I realized that effectively I'm middle management, and actually I'm part of the, it's easy to explain, like the people above me are the conservative ones, but I'm one of the people who's like, we can't cope with that, right? We can't stop just sending me initiatives I can't cope with. And I think that a lot of, for me, there's a lot of restrictions that come from the environment. And part of that environment, someone, I think Tanya mentioned the learning journey. And I think a lot of universities are organized around what careers advise, you know, what 16 and 17-year-old students believe of what careers advisors tell them. So there's this complete myth you have with applicants for architecture that they need to do maths, which is not true, but careers advisors believe it. So all these students go and do maths at A level in order to be architects when they don't need to. Anyway, but the power they have, and universities are all organized around what disciplines that 16s and 17-year-olds can imagine themselves doing. It's very conservative. The organization comes from very conservative application admissions environments. If you have a course that isn't a recognizable name, you just don't get, you know, so many students on it. So I think there's something, you know, one of the leverage points for how universities are organized is actually careers advice outside of universities.
So
I think that's absolutely true.
Nick?
I think it's absolutely true. When we were changing all our degree programs, one of the things I did was go and talk to school students. And I spoke to the school students because careers advisors were basically so ill-informed and terrible, which is probably the fault of the universities. But I spoke to the school students and sort of asked them about, you know, how did they choose their A-level subjects, for example. You know, I guess if I asked a university admissions tutor how school students chose their A-level subjects, they'd probably say something along the lines of, well, they think about their career and they think I need to do maths, physics and chemistry and so on. Talking to the school students, they choose it because the answers I got, the most common answer by far was they hated maths, or they hated the maths teacher. The next one was that some friend or girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever was doing certain subjects, so they chose to do that. Another one was about a timetable clash with football, and so on. So it became very clear that the A-level choices that we were taking terribly seriously as to what these A-level choices were as a university were in many cases quite arbitrary. So I just removed all the requirement for subjects. And so civil engineering at UCL, you can come into UCL with whatever A-level subject you like at a grade. And I got into terrible trouble with the university, but there was no rule that said I couldn't. So therefore that was tough. And the institution thought it was terrible because I didn't ask for mathematics. And then I pointed out to them that our mathematics performance in the students shot up as a result of this. And the whole, I think Ben is absolutely right. We've got this completely wrong. Students are people, and people have lives, and they do things, and they have inspirations, and they act, and they respond to these things. Actually, our role in university, I don't think, is to teach civil engineering to people who want to be civil engineers. I think our role is actually to teach them how you're going to change the world, how you're going to make the future world better for society and the planet. And we can use civil engineering as a kind of example. Because some of the things that you learn, how you make a bridge stand up, the sort of concepts that you have to handle in order to do that are not a lot different from how you make a society stand up. The principles are. And so it teaches you to think about those sort of things, and that's what you go into. So I think good university education, it doesn't matter what subject you do, because you will always use it in your future life. The big mistake is to think that a subject is so narrow that you can only do one thing with it. And I think that is one of the channels that we've got into more recently, that this sort of sense, and it starts, as Ben says, it starts from school and it goes on into government circles, because their knowledge of universities is about their time as an undergraduate.
Yeah.
And that drives the whole way of actually thinking about the thing. And I think that is one of the hegemonies we have to break. If you want to have a university sector that is actually useful for society, we have to break that hard link.
Thanks,
Thanks, Nick.
really interesting.
Could we send that back to Leon to comment on? Because I think Nick and I are both quite different from the direct thing that you started with. And but I really liked when you were discussing it that you put in learning to be a protester, as well as learn to build a rocket. And I'd be interested in teaching people to be protesters by teaching them to be engineers, right? So anyway,
Leon,
can we go back to you?
Yeah, so before I get to my overall point, Nick, I'm one of the people in terms of maths. I hated my maths teacher. She blamed me for everything I got wrong, which doesn't feel like a teaching thing. And in terms of the careers advice, yeah, actually, I was recommended away from economics simply because I wasn't getting good maths grades. Yeah, I got into university, my maths grade went up. In terms of the overall point, at least from what I'm understanding, in terms of subverting what teaching is, and what actually Ben said earlier, where he said that the conversation was going towards readopting polytechnics. From what I'm getting as a summary, I feel like it's sort of a curve that goes up, and how a curve that goes up is an average, goes up and down. So in terms of what I'm seeing, I feel like the question, how do we organize a university, is something that's going to have to keep coming up every so often. I can't give an exact date on it, 5, 10 years, whatever, provided the context changes. I mean, I don't know who it was that said universities would be headless chickens if something comes in. But, that really struck something with me. And I think right now the change, at least from what I'm understanding, needs to be more towards the learning of it, the learning of your character, the learning to learn, actually, rather than the content itself. I mean, I cannot remember where I read it, but it was, you can learn anything you want. The one thing you can't learn when you get older is character. So I feel like that's where universities need to focus on. A key, if you even look at careers themselves, a lot of them don't put degrees as it is. And if they do, they look at the skills within the degree, the critical thinking, the real world applications, the somebody join in here because I'm starting to go blank, the general teamwork. And yeah, so in terms of the protest, the point that Ben brought up, I think there as well is in terms of the character building that universities should be providing, the overall learning to learn.
Thanks, Leon. Wow, and that's good because learning to learn is something that's come up several times. So it's 10 to 5, so it's nearly time for us to stop. I'm going to go back to the voice of society in the shape of Catherine. So Tanya, do you have a question or a comment? Would it work better before or after the voice of society?
I think I just have a small amount of input that would work better before, because it relates to what Leon just said about headless chickens. And I just wanted to throw this in there as food for thought, the fact that we've spoken of private companies like Google, perhaps getting ahead of the game and leaving universities as headless chickens. What if from my knowledge and from my experience, a lot of people feel disenfranchised with the education system because of exactly what Leon said. And it seems that by universities choosing to conform to this existing malpractice, it's just furthering that. So just a general food for thought is, what if GU is the one who is the first to realize this and changes their approach towards, more oriented towards learning as opposed to the learning outcomes and everything Leon said. So surely it's better for the power to remain with the academic in people, with the real academics within universities. And perhaps that is why it's time we realize that it's the people that run the show and it's the people that can bring change. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you. Catherine.
Hello.
You've been looking very thoughtful.
Yes, no, I think, and this is just me, I think that the point about learning to learn, which is, as we said, is everything. Because if you learn how to do something, I mean, we all know the adage, you know, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish, etc. If you learn how to learn, then it might be a bit time consuming, but you can actually approach the vast majority of problems, go back to first principles and say, what is this telling me? And therefore, what is the solution? I mean, you know, the question you asked up front, how to organize a university, first thing I thought is, well, what's the point of a university? You can't answer that organizational point until you are able to actually get to the heart of the matter. And I think Tanya's point about universities and institutions generally are being about people is absolutely true. I think with both Leon and Tanya, it sort of reminds me of how when you're 20 years old, the world seems to be full of possibilities, and then you obviously then subsequently make some sort of contact, you know, with the world as it actually is. But I think the points that both Leon and Tanya have made are absolutely spot on. And I also like the subversiveness that that Nick was talking about, because ultimately, if you always do things the same way, nothing changes. The only people who make it different are the people who try something different, and you know, they will fail a lot of the time. I mean, the thing that I always think about is Isaac Newton sitting under an apple tree. I don't know how many millions of people over the course of the centuries have sat under apple trees and watched apples fall. But what was it that made him look and think, actually, you know what, that's quite interesting, and then go off and come up with a theory of gravity and all the rest of it. And I think it's that ability to take back a step back and go, oh, that's interesting. I wonder why. That I think universities should help equip young people with, because then whatever subject they study, whether it's a very technical subject like engineering, we've been talking about engineering, or whether it's a much more of an art subject or a language or whatever it happens to be, if you know how to learn, you know how to approach problems, you can think about things critically, then actually you've got a far better chance of solving whatever the problem is in front of you. Fantastic. And that's good for society.
Thank you, Catherine. Right, everybody, it is about 5 minutes to 5. I'd love to give you an erudite, thoughtful and considered summary of everything that we have thought and heard this afternoon.
Go on, John. Go on.
No chance of that at all, other than maybe the threads of subversion and of learning to learn and understanding what is it we want university for.
And community, I think, John. I think it's quite interesting how strongly that's come through. I know, Tanya, you've versed it several times, but this, you know, don't forget we the people are the university.
I've just written that down because that may end up being the, you know, so the community, you know, what do we want the thing to do for us? What do we want to do with it? And what do we want to do for it? I think then becomes sort of an interesting set of three questions to keep asking. The business model should be a function of what we want from the university, not the other way around. And I think what we and I call it a business, the way we fund and organise should be a product of the things we want the university to do rather than the other way up. And I think at the moment that if I had a dog, its tail might well be wagging it, might be sort of one way of describing where we are. So the plan after this afternoon is, first of all, I'll edit the video and get it out so that you can all look back at what you said when you're in your quiet moments. Working with Peter, and Peter's just realised he's volunteered for this, we will try and draw out a bit threads and ideas and summaries and thoughts and reflections and share all of those with you, with the intention of saying, you know, when we get together and we have an open conversation about a badly defined question, and it was a consciously badly designed question, and because we didn't want to constrain where it went, then these are the interesting thoughts that come out of it. What we then might be able to do with that is get to something that maybe talks about community and purpose and we the people, and start to articulate a different vision of future university, which I think would be a fun thing to do. So Nick, Catherine, Leon, thank you for taking the time in advance to give this some thought before coming into the afternoon. And yes, I will sort of clap our hands and stuff to say thank you for that. I had a good time, which was really almost mainly the purpose, in a sense, was to say, get some interesting people in a shared space and see if we could have an interesting. Have you all found it a useful use of your time?
Mm-hmm.
Have you enjoyed it?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's, for me, if we the people, and we're doing some subversive stuff and we're creating a community, then we're doing some of the right things. Tanya, thank you for massive contribution as well. It's really, really good. I think the spread of us from young to mature, I think is fantastic, and I think we should have much more of these sorts of conversations where
Agree, actually, yeah.
Literally spreading across generations, and in the case of Boris and Ed and Eva, who's now left us, extending ourselves into various other parts of the world, which is brilliant. So I will again say, on behalf of myself and Peter, thank you all very much. It's been brilliant, and we will be in contact soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, everyone.
Great in the chair. Thanks, Ben.